Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. This one is of particular interest to me because it's my opportunity to discuss in greater detail the work of a writer I've admired for many, many years, the great Daniel Pinchbeck. I last saw Daniel speak, I think it was at a book launch at Watkins Bookshop around about 3 years ago, because both Daniel and I are both writers for Watkins Publishing. And it was Daniel's new book, and we had the opportunity to meet there. And I've also seen Daniel speak at Breaking Convention a few years ago as well. Now, Daniel's work is very intriguing to me because it mirrors in many ways my own work and my own research in terms of altered states of consciousness, the role of dimethyltryptamine, the role of entities and everything else as well. So we're going to have the wonderful opportunity here to talk to somebody who's been researching this for an awful long time, and somebody I know who has really traveled the journey. I know there are individuals like myself that are very much armchair travelers, but in terms of I'm very much a kind of a 19th century equivalent of the 19th century anthropologists who never actually left their home, people like Tyler. Whereas Daniel Pinchbeck is somebody that really has done the adventures. And if you take the opportunity to read his book, Breaking Open the Head, you'll discover that Daniel has traveled the world trying to find and pushing the envelope of what it is about human experience and consciousness and everything else as well. I'll tell you very quickly a little bit about Daniel. He's the best-selling author of Breaking Open the Head, and in 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. I can never pronounce that correctly. He co-founded the web magazine Reality Sandwich and the online platform Evolve.net. He was featured in the 2010 documentary 2012 Time for Change and hosted the talk show Mindshift on Gaiam TV. He directed the think tank Center for Planetary Culture. His essays and articles have appeared in a vast range of publications, including the New York Times, Esquire, Rolling Stone, and ArtForum, and he's been a columnist for Dazed and Confused. So that's a very potted introduction, which really doesn't give true justice to the involvement that, that Daniel has had over the years. So what I would like to do initially, Daniel, is just for a very, very quick background, because your background is almost as interesting as you are in terms of your family, your parents and everything else as well, including a fascinating link to the great Jack Kerouac. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in New York City, and my father was an abstract painter who was got one of those like old lofts in Soho in the late 60s, and then just sort of clung on to it for decades. And they separated. My parents separated when I was about like 5 or 6. My mother was a writer and a book editor who edited a lot of radical leftist books in the 60s, like Abbie Hoffman's books and books by like Black radicals and so on. And in the 50s, when she was very young, she'd been the girlfriend of Jack Kerouac and had been friends with a lot of the Beat Generation figures, and wrote a memoir, Minor Characters, that won a award, National Book Critics Circle Award in 1983. It was really a beautiful book about just her experiences growing up in New York and her experiences with the Beats, and sort of meditating on the status of women in that group, which was a very male group, and so on. So yeah, those were some of my salient background points. And then I worked in magazines. I dropped out of college. I never finished college. I worked in magazines. I kind of worked my way up, doing commercial writing and journalism. I also edited a literary magazine with some friends. Then I had an existential meltdown in my mid to late 20s. I'd come out of the scientific materialist worldview, and I began to feel that life was kind of meaningless. And that kind of led me back to psychedelics, which I'd explored a little bit in college. And then I started taking them again in New York and looking into them and writing about them, writing articles for the Village Voice, other magazines. And then that ultimately led to the exploration of the first book, Breaking Open the Head.
Fascinating. So that this in itself, in terms of the background, the milieu and the situation you found yourself in was both fascinating and interesting. And I think with many of us, we all go through that dark night of the soul where we suddenly start to question, particularly if you read deeply a lot of, particularly the existentialist writers, and I think of people like Sartre and everybody else and de Beauvoir, and you'd start to worry about exactly what is existence and what am I? What am I experiencing? And indeed, what is the greater meaning of everything? And that was one of the things that were fascinating about you, that you actually went out and you walk the walk and you talk the talk. And one of the things that your book really discusses in great detail is your experiences with Iboga in the Gabon. Could you tell us a little bit about that and the experiences that you had when down there, and how indeed it was all facilitated? Because, you know, a place like Gabon is...
Are you sure you want, because I've gone over these things so much around that first book, which was like 20 years ago now. I mean, what was exciting, you know, about that book at that time is it really was kind of like an edgy exploration. Like in the mainstream in New York, you couldn't really talk about psychedelics. Like if I tried to speak about them with, you know, because I worked in the magazine world, people who were in media or in the art world, they were really looked down upon. You know, when I published the first book, Breaking Open the Head, I used to have like a fear that I would be stopped at airports or whatever. I mean, it really still felt very edgy. I mean, right now, psychedelics are reaching this unbelievable level of mass acceptance. I mean, the media is reporting on them all the time, but how useful they are for mental health. Yes, when I wrote that book, I did a lot of the research in the late 90s, early 2000s. Book came out in 2002, and it was still much more primitive territory. So I found a botanist who was working with the Bwiti indigenous culture in Gabon, who use iboga, which is the root bark of a plant, the iboga bush, as their sacrament. And it's a very long-lasting visionary plant sacrament. It lasts like 20 hours. I mean, I've just talked about it so much, so it's a little bit like repetitive for me. But you know, it has many different phases to it, and yeah. What else do you want to know?
Well, can we focus in then in terms of more specific details in terms of this, which reflects my own writing, which I'm particularly interested in? One of the things you wrote, that during your Iboga experience, you stated that you encountered, and I quote you, something that I could only describe as a force or even an entity, took me by the hand and led me through my life to that point. And later you then refer to that as the holographic index of my memories. Now, this particularly intrigues me because for many years I've been quite fascinated by the panoramic life review that takes place during near-death experiences. Could you share a little bit about that experience then, and how vivid that was, and what your interpretation of that was?
Yeah, I mean, so going back a long time now, this is, you know, probably almost 25 years ago that I had that experience. But yeah, I mean, there's different phases. There's this phase where your eyes are open, you're looking into a mirror, and you see different scenes in the mirror. At one point, I saw actually, with my eyes open, a hallucination, which is very rare for me, of a sort of statuesque figure walking across the room made of tree branches, sitting down next to the shaman. And apparently, when I told this to them later, they were like, "Oh yeah, that's Iboga. That's the spirit of Iboga that comes out and engages you in conversation." So, you know, one of my ideas from all sorts of experiences is that you know, whatever these plants are, they're actually connected to, you know, kind of other forms of consciousness that you know, maybe live in another dimension, in the astral plane or something, and they interact with us, you know, through the chemical medium, you know, of the plant material when we consume it. Yeah, they seem to have a certain purpose and intention. And I did the Iboga again when I wrote, you know, my 2012 book down in Mexico, and I had more of like a verbal interaction with the Iboga. But so yeah, Iboga tends to feel like a more masculine force, and feels like it actually really is kind of a guide, in that it shows people kind of like where they're messing up and where they've made mistakes in their lives, what they have to do. And it's one of its main applications has been in addictions, breaking the cycle of addiction with heroin in particular. But in my case, yeah, I mean, I was shown kind of like taken on a course from early childhood, remembering different scenes that I wasn't really aware of, or hadn't really, you know, put much conscious focus on, that were very significant psychologically. And I also saw the effects of alcohol. At one point, there was like a loop where it was showing me scenes of myself drinking at literary cocktail parties over and over again, acting like a buffoon, and being kind of messed up the next day, and so on. So it was really like really shining a spotlight on your kind of faults and weaknesses, but also kind of like, you know, empathetically kind of showing you how you've been sort of constructed subjectively, you know, psychologically through conditioning, through certain experiences and so on. You know.
How was your viewpoint in that? Were you re-experiencing it? Were you witnessing as if it was a movie in front of you?
Yeah, it's really going back 25 years at this point. Yeah, I mean, it was in a you know, kind of holographic, you know, felt memory experience. You know, you're both within it and outside of it, and re-experiencing the emotions connected to it, and so on.
Intriguing, because one of the previous guests on this show was somebody who had a profound near-death experience in the sea. He fell into the sea and was dying of hypothermia. And he again had similar kind of flashbacks where he was given kind of snapshots of his past life. But what happened was he found himself physically in the body of the person, or the really reliving and feeling the feelings he felt at the time. So it seems to be that there's some kind of way that the brain can record in some way, or there's some kind of recording mechanism that can hold this information that can be replayed in one way or another. And it seems to me that Iboga and DMT seem to be able to facilitate that in some way. But particularly, you know, the role of these entities, as you said, you know, there was a force that was guiding you, which again intrigues me. And you know, in terms of that, and I know we'll get on to the more new stuff, but one of the things that I'm very interested in as well is your interpretation of the, and I know you mentioned it in the book, the work of people like Jeremy Narby and the links between DMT entities and DNA, this kind of thing, the cosmic serpent idea. Do you follow that idea or not?
Which idea? That
the idea that Narby was saying that the symbolism of the cosmic serpent, you know, the idea of the DNA helix and the way in which the serpents seem to mimic the DNA as if they're their own DNA trying to instruct us in one way or another.
Well, I mean, Narby's idea that DNA is somehow like a crystalline structure that emits light and that it might actually be sending us like scenes from the archetypal unconscious, that I haven't really seen any evidence for, like any follow-up. But yeah, I mean, there's this archetype of twined serpents that does seem like it's kind of universal. Even apparently, according to Narby, in like cultures where they don't even really have many snakes around or any snakes around. So you know, that it may be that there's some archetypal connection there.
Yeah, because it intrigues me that, you know, to what the links are there in many ways. So in terms of your own role then, in terms of the article, the Occult Control System, UFO, Aliens and Other Dimensions and Future Timelines, which is a comparatively new article of yours written in the last few years. Can you explain a little bit about the viewpoints and where you're moving in terms of those ideas?
Well, I mean, you know, so I mean, just my trajectory was I wrote Breaking Open the Head. It came out in 2002. And that book charted, as I said, my shift from scientific kind of materialist worldview to kind of recognizing the psychic, you know, kind of aspects, kind of more like a Carl Jungian or shamanic kind of perspective on the nature of reality, just from my own phenomenological experiences, comparing those with, you know, works of a lot of authors and other people's direct anecdotal experience and so on. Then I wrote the second book, 2012, where I got very interested in different cultures around the world, indigenous and ancient cultures that seem to have prophetic understanding of the nature of this time that we're going through as being very, very transformative. And as part of that 2012 book, I began to look around because, you know, when you do psychedelics, you get extremely complex, you know, geometries, patterned information that appears that doesn't feel as if, you know, your mind is just generating it. It feels like you're accessing something, you know, archetypal or you know, in the structure of the cosmos in some way. And then I was wondering, okay, well, if that's the case, are there any corollaries, you know, in the physical world that have a similar, you know, kind of sense? And then I discovered the crop circles, these patterns that appear in England, you know, mainly in other places around the world. And I ended up going, I think it was like 2001, I went and visited some of the crop circles when they were being, you know, I spent a summer in Wiltshire. Maybe it was 2001, 2002. and visited them as they appeared and so on. And so that ultimately, and I did a lot of research. I mean, I still tend to come from a skeptical place. Sometimes I get lumped into kind of New Ageism, but I mean, from my perspective, I really try to field test every idea and possibility, and try to have a good epistemology. I don't know what you would call it even, but over time and through the experience of studying that phenomena, I definitely ended up convinced that some of those formations are not made by humans unless we have some type of advanced technology that no one's talking about at this point. So that suggested there was another type of consciousness that was communicating that might be interdimensional or extraterrestrial or both or whatever. So that then opened up the whole question of kind of aliens, occult beings. I mean, I'd already gotten interested in Rudolf Steiner's work. Steiner continues to be a really crucial person for me in terms of develop what this philosopher Bernardo Kastrup talks about as a hermeneutics of everything. If we're living actually in a universe of consciousness, then we're kind of allowed to think about meaning again and levels of meaning and just all sorts of things that our society has shut down kind of prematurely. So I tend to think that there are these occult levels of reality. There are forms of consciousness that we can have some access to, but maybe are far more evolved than we are, maybe are not even in physical form or capable of taking physical form, as Steiner talks about. And some of these other forms of consciousness may be kind of impacting on our evolution for their own purposes. Like Steiner talks about the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic being two kind of powers, forms of being that are working through humanity to bring about their own desired aims. So then I got interested in, lots of different works on kind of the possibility there's an alien or extraterrestrial, interdimensional kind of manipulation going on. Jacques Vallée, I think, was the one who talked about the UFOs as being part of a consciousness control system. That even the way that these areas invite ridicule and are so absurd and sort of fall outside of any logical or rational constructs seems to also be part of this control system, because they make it so that the people, the mainstream people, the sort of normal people can't find any way to take them seriously, so they just throw them out and dismiss them. So those were some of the ideas, and I guess I do kind of harbor this intuitive, feeling, that I support as much as I can, that, there's some kind of manipulation going on. I mean, Steiner talked about the sort of Ahriman. He was an esoteric Christian, so he said instead of the devil, which was a very simplistic idea, there just being this one, negative force, there were actually all these different kind of other forces, like astral forces, kind of working on humanity to move us into their desired outcome. And he talked about the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic as two types of being that were kind of pulling away at us. And he believed actually that Christ was a example for humanity of how to walk in between these influences, the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic. But the Ahrimanic forces are the ones that are kind of pulling us towards materialism, technology.
So this is Ahriman in terms of Zoroastrianism, I guess. So
exactly. That's where he takes it from. Yeah, but Steiner actually argued that the 21st century, and he was writing back in the late 19th, early 20th century, was going to see the incarnation of Ahriman. That in the way Christ had incarnated as a spiritual force 2,000 years ago, Ahriman was actually going to express itself in the physical world in a way that it hadn't up to this point. And we were being prepared for this inevitable event, which would be difficult, but was also a necessary part of our evolution. And so I find intimations of that, both in the flying saucer myth that Carl Jung talked about, and the sort of abduction accounts, and where that seems to be pushing us in some kind of archetypal and conscious way. And then also the rapid movement towards artificial intelligence technocratic control systems, surveillance, genetic engineering, biotechnology. I feel all of this is part of this kind of event, this epochal event in humanity's history that Steiner talked about as the incarnation of Ahriman.
Well, this is very intriguing because this comment has come up a few times now. I'm a huge fan of Jacques Vallée and have been for many years, and indeed even going further back to John Keel and Project Trojan Horse. And in my previous book, The Hidden Universe, I very much take this viewpoint that there's some form of force that seems to have a direct relationship with us in some way, as if we somehow create it, almost tulpa-like. And I call it the Aggregorial, and the idea that there seems to be a symbiotic relationship here. But I was very intrigued when you made the comment before about when you were looking at the crop circles in Wiltshire, and you were there in the fields when the events were taking place. Can you explain a little bit more about it? I'm very intrigued by that, because I'm very much on the fence in terms of crop circles. So you witnessed something happening, did you?
Well, I never witnessed a crop circle being made, but we were living, in that area, and there was sort of like a network of people who were following it. So every morning, if a new one had appeared, you would be able to go and visit that one immediately. And you would find, if they were, very new, that there was kind of like a palpable, energetic charge in the field. There were the biophysicists who did the research on what happened to the plants, the formations, and basically published in peer-reviewed science journals that have never been refuted, that there were sort of electromagnetic changes in the plants on a molecular level. It wasn't just they were like flattened with boards and string. Some type of energy from above, sort of microwave-ish or something had hit them and forced them to move in this different direction. So so there was the incredible perfection of these formations, the fact that they appeared in such a tiny amount of time, synchronicities connected to them. Following the formation was a very psychedelic kind of experience, because you felt as you were drawn into the phenomenon, you would get these kind of clues, these sort of labyrinthine passageways, but what I wrote in the book is that I felt that the phenomenon as a whole is actually a teaching, multi-level teaching, on the nature of reality and the nature of consciousness. And partially it's about the paradoxical nature of consciousness and reality, and about how, because Nietzsche even talked about how, this idea of cause and effect is actually just an idea of the human mind. And, for all we know, there isn't really, cause and effect in the way we actually ascribe it to the world. So with some of these crop circles, it was like you couldn't ascribe a single cause. There was like very, very good evidence that it was made by an outside force, and then also, significant evidence that humans had made them. That actually seemed to be part of the mystery, kind of like, kind of like a Zen, koan, like the sound of one hand clapping or something like that. And it was wrestling with this phenomenon over months, ultimately led to kind of like koan like realization of sort of the paradoxical, intrinsically paradoxical nature of reality, and that I guess in a way it's made up quality. It's narrativity. It's mythological, structure. So that for me was like a permanent shift in my perception about
because it's something you pointed out there that again has long intrigued me, and again with discussions of previous guests here as well, is the curious nature of the phenomenon itself. It seems to be playing with us. It seems to be, as you quite rightly say and very accurately say there, that it almost wants to discredit itself. It almost seems to lead us along the lines of ridiculing us in one way or another and leading people along. And I mean, I've been interested in ufology ever since the mid-1960s, and it's long intrigued me as to how the phenomenon plays with us, and it culturally tracks us and it mocks us. And in your book, you mentioned, for instance, the work of Evans Wentz in terms of the fairy folk in Celtic countries and everything else as well. So the phenomenon goes back a long way. But it seems to me, with crop circles, the geometric beauty of some of them is extraordinary. And you got to ask the question, well, why would they do it unless they're trying to confuse us in some way, or play with us in some way? I don't know, do you have an opinion of what motivations they may have other than just a way of helping humanity understand the mysteries of consciousness and maybe even quantum mechanics and the idea of the wave function, wave particle duality and all these other things? Do you think there's a game being played, or do you think there's more to it?
Well, I mean, I think there's more to it. I mean, it feels like, over the 20 years, they've left us a very, very significant visual language. And there have been, if you go to like crop circle connector, .co.uk, there have been people who've, put a huge amount of energy in that time into laying out the, the floor plans, the proportions, all these aspects of the phenomenon, the references, whether it's to like, astrological events or astronomical conjunctions, the relationship between these patterns and like images from sacred geometries and from Hermetic traditions and so on. So it feels like they've, of course it could all be a fraud, but what it feels like is that some intelligence outside of humans, or maybe it's us from the future, has gone out of the way to create a very, very complex, symbolic language that's evolved over many years and has kind of left it for us to decode, when we're ready to do that, and there are people who think that, there's like, groups of imagery that are really about, for instance, how you could construct like new energy devices or propulsion devices. Things very much related to alchemy, the idea of the great work, the Hermetic tradition. So, the messages from, the star nations, as indigenous cultures, I've called them. So yeah, for whatever reason, we're not up to, I expected when I wrote the 2012 book that everyone would be like, okay, cool. Like, let's create a commission. We'll put in, a few $1 million, and someone will, we'll have a research think tank, and we'll study all the patterns, and we'll try to understand, what's being conveyed and how we communicate back with them. So there's all this like interesting, suggestive data of like psychics who actually were able to communicate with the pattern. But none of that happens. If anything, the phenomenon has just gone on in this very like peculiar, marginalized way. So I don't know if that means that we've missed our opportunity, or if it's just something that's there for the future. If anybody, if humanity ever wants to rise to the occasion of.
Well, there are people we know that we interviewed, for instance, Steve Merrow. And if you check out the interview we did with Steve about 2 weeks ago, he's part of a research project that are doing some extraordinary work in terms of the phenomena in general. And, again, we were discussing with Steve the impishness, the kind of the Loki factor almost of the phenomenon, how it plays with us. And then interestingly enough, we had another guest on recently who was saying the same thing. So there is a degree of work being done at the moment. And indeed, I'm working with a group of people at the moment with a project where we're going to be reproducing the Philip experiment and the idea of how we seem to be able to create the environment around us whereby these things manifest. They need us to draw themselves through in some way, as if they're either a form of plasma or a form of energy. And indeed, the way they seem to play upon fear, and they seem to feed upon fear, which is all very intriguing. Now, this then moves on very quickly. I'll just draw Sarah in quickly, and then
hold on a second. I think that it does seem as if there are some beings, maybe if you want to entertain this whole hypothesis, that are more fear-based, oriented around fear. But I don't think a lot of the, there also seems to be a lot of benevolence agency, particularly involved with the crop circles. If anything, there's been specific warnings in those crop circle formations around these kind of beings who are seeking to like hyper accelerate our technological progress through like certain gifts and so on.
Because that's a fascinating point, isn't it? The point you made before, are they to do with our own future selves? Because I know that your recent work has been very, very ecological in its basis. And do you think there is a concern about what we are doing with the planet at the moment? Because if these entities are related to us and are telluric, or they are part of humanity in some way. They have a direct relationship with the ecology of this planet. So therefore, whatever we do with the planet is obviously going to have a detrimental effect on them as well. So can we move on to your recent work, and then we'll move back to this very interesting topic. But I know you're very keen to get on to the latest work you've been doing as well. So what's your opinions on that?
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously it's quite difficult to talk about a lot of the stuff in our reduced language. I mean, yeah, because there's so much that we don't know, which I think is lovely. I mean, it's great. Like, science has been so, the Western, sort of masculine patriarchal thing has been like, oh, we've only got to figure out like 2% more stuff and we'll know everything. Well, now it turns out that what percentage of like the universe is actually dark matter and dark energy, of which we don't understand anything at all, like 60% or 80% or something. So yeah, I mean, I tend to ascribe to kind of certain ideas from like, tantric philosophy, like this idea that like samsara is nirvana. So, when we experience as kind of like the turbulent day-to-day reality that we're meshed in, is kind of, underlying that is the sort of, void-like perfection, the emptiness, the nirvana, the, infinite euphoric, bliss of this emptiness. And so, as much as we get concerned and caught up in, our stuff, that's just one level or one vector. And, ultimately everything is perfect. It's all, doing what it has to do. It doesn't mean we shouldn't protest, fossil fuel stuff, or, stop wars or help kids, but, I think, when you have certain, esoteric experiences that, can be stimulated by certain psychedelics like 5-MeO-DMT, or it can happen through meditation or whatever, you end up with an inherent sense that, the universe is just doing its thing and it's all, perfect. And so, to think about beings that are at a higher, this much more evolved state of like consciousness, maybe not material anymore, being sort of concerned about our ecological crisis, feels a lot of imposition of like our ideas onto things that we probably don't really understand as of yet,
Because I know that you discuss
if there were, I mean, if the gods wanted humanity to have figured it out, we would have already figured it out. We would have been smart enough to work it out. For whatever reason, we're meant to be in this sort of gawky, adolescent condition, which, maybe we emerge into, Homo noosfericus and become something greater, or maybe this is just, a botch and, we go extinct, but we've left plastics, behind, and someday, some like cockroach species, merges with something else and becomes like a super sentience of a different type altogether. So whatever it is, it is what it is.
Well, it's one of the things you've mentioned on a few occasions in your writings. The whole gnostic viewpoint as well. That there's a reality behind this reality, the pleroma, the fullness, and we're stuck inside a kenoma, which is ruled by the demiurge or Yaldabaoth or whatever we want to call it, and the idea that it is a kind of a test, or it's something we have to get through in one way or another. And that again is intriguing because, as Jacob Boehme said, you could go insane by just looking at the reflection on a pewter dish. And I sometimes feel that people like you and I are so fascinated by these things that you almost get lost in it. Now, whereas you've walked the walk and had the experiences, which I haven't, and this is the thing that I think is profoundly important. But I'd like to draw Sarah in here now. Sarah, have you any points, observations thus far?
Well, all very interesting. Daniel did ask about dreams, actually. Daniel Taylor asked what you thought about messages that people receive in their dreams, Daniel, with regards to, he mentioned specifically the locations of where people died or murders that people get clues to in their dreams. Do you think that's something that can tap into a kind of collective unconscious?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I think there's precognitive dreams or morning where like, people reached out to me, sort of out of nowhere, and were like, oh, I had this dream that you died in a car crash and I was supposed to go on a car trip the next day, and changed my plans. So I think it's every indigenous, all these shamanic cultures, are very well aware of the power of dreams to give us cues, information on so many levels. And then then you have like very evolved cultures that have like very evolved science of dreaming in a way, like the Tibetan Buddhists, where the lamas can actually go and get teachings, lucid dreaming. They can be transmitted like termas, like scriptures, to bring back that evolved Tibetan Buddhist practice. I mean, I think dreaming is like a crucial element in consciousness.
And then one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is with regards to psychedelic experience and the kind of shamanic tourism industry that seems to exist now. A lot of people have their dark night of the soul after experiencing psychedelics, and there seems to be like the potential for ego inflation there as well, whether or not people are conscious of it. But some of these mind-blowing, transcendental, godlike experiences can confuse an individual. What do you think about having to work through those kinds of things, and how do you differentiate between the imaginal and kind of the veracity of a psychedelic experience and opening up something that's really true?
Those are complicated questions. I mean, one thing that's happened over the last 20 years as this whole enterprise has become more and more popular in the West is we're seeing like more and more people who specialize as like integration counselors, who work with people after, like, so you don't just go to the Amazon and do the ayahuasca, then come back. You also have somebody who talks with you a week after, and a month after, and 6 months after. So you're able to kind of, I mean, in traditionally in the indigenous cultures, kind of initiation was part of a larger, holistic process where you would have the elders of the community would sit with the person who'd gone through the visionary initiation and would help them kind of like understand the meaning of the visions for the community, but even also kind of give them their place in the community based on, what had come through them. And that's, because we're from a shattered culture that lost any understanding of these things, we're kind of rediscovering it on the fly. And so there's different thresholds in that discovery. I mean, looking back, actually, I myself feel that I messed up because I didn't do enough work to integrate certain experiences. I think they had a negative impact on my psychology for a long time. And I know other people who, I have friends who ended up in mental institutions, at least for some time. And so there are dangers to, these experiences.
I guess within indigenous
talk about. What's that?
Within indigenous communities, there is, generally speaking, a shared worldview that perhaps we don't have in the Western world, and also we're more subject to niche traumas. That perhaps in an indigenous community where there are more well-established rules and ways of functioning in a small society, you don't experience. So I wonder as well, like what you think about, especially with something like DMT or ayahuasca, how the experiences of someone in the West taking it compare with someone in an indigenous group.
How they compare. I mean, there's just so much to unpack there, but I mean, it turns out there's a lot of, I mean, this guy, Benny Shannon, wrote a very long book called The Far Antipodes of the Mind, where he, did a sort of cross-cultural analysis of the kind of visions and kind of mythologies that self-arise during ayahuasca. And he actually found a lot of cross-cultural similarities. So even if somebody went knowing nothing about, the jungle, they would still often have like experiences of like panthers or jaguars or snakes or vines or whatever. So that's quite interesting. I mean, what's actually really fascinating about what's happening now, and I'm sure I hope you guys have been covering this, is like the rapid mainstreaming of psychedelics. Like a lot of new, hundreds of new companies are starting up. I mean, they're just beginning to decriminalize psychedelic use in some areas in the US, like Portland and Denver and Oakland and so on. And there's a huge gold rush now to some of these companies have billion-dollar market caps, and they're approaching it. Some of them are backed by a lot of Silicon Valley money, people like Peter Thiel, and they're actually approaching it as like a new pharmaceutical industry where they're trying to patent. Like there's one company which is using AI to map out, the whole kind of all the possibilities, parameters of different psychedelic compounds, and then patent them in advance so they can claim that they've discovered all these compounds. When I wrote Breaking Open the Head, I interviewed Sasha Shulgin, who was a genius chemist who was responsible for a lot of the psychedelics that are used today, including 2CB is one that he discovered. He rediscovered MDMA and synthesized it in the 60s. And he published 2 books of his research with his wife, Tikal and Peake, and he published all the formulas for all of the chemicals, and he described the experiences they had as they took them. They would sort of up the dose slowly over weeks and so on, and they would get all the trip reports. And he did that all consciously, to keep it out of the hands of the government. Like he didn't want to be Wilhelm Reich, because all of the work got destroyed or whatever, or Tesla. But I think also maybe he was aware that eventually there would be commercial application. So by putting all of these hundreds of compounds in the public domain, Shulgin has made it impossible for these new companies to patent them and claim them as their own thing. So I think actually it turns out that was like a very positive thing that he did for the future.
How do you think this psychedelic renaissance will play out within society? Do you think this is something that's going to be a regular therapeutic practice embraced by, say, the NHS, for example, in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, so the question of what's going to happen in the future is super complicated. I think we're, I run courses on my own platform, theliminalinstitute.com, and among the things that I have there, include an new audio version of my 2012 book, which we never had before. But we also we made a talk free from this guy Christopher Bosch, who you may know, wrote a book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe, and he had many high dose LSD experiences, and he had like visions of the near future where he saw kind of like breakdown of these sort of large scale, nation state structures as the ecological crisis becomes more and more pervasive. But then he ultimately saw kind of a new networks forming, like smaller scale communities with these sort of mycelial networks of connections, surviving past this current threshold event of ecological collapse. So, for me, psychedelics are clearly going to be of great value in the near future, because people are going to be experiencing a lot of trauma from the breakdown of their known environments and their expectations about the future. And psychedelics can help people sort of become phenomenologically reground in the present and actually just find joy in whatever is happening to them. And we're seeing like incredible success with the work with MAPS is doing with MDMA, where they have it almost, probably in the next 2 or 3 years approved as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. So they've had like 60% cure rate with veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars who have treatment of worse forms of PTSD. So I think we're going to see a lot of there's going to be a lot of trauma, a lot of refugees, a lot of breakdowns, and we're going to need these tools on a larger scale to, help people get their act back together again.
I guess one thing with psychedelics is the ability they have to help people feel a deeper connection to nature, and that I think is probably going to end up being our savior. And perhaps we need to reconfigure our appreciation of nature into an appreciation of something divine, because I think having kind of lost religions, to a great extent, I think human beings need something spiritual or divine to believe in, and perhaps nature is a way of satisfying or merging sort of science and rational and material with something divine and immaterial as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I wrote about that in my book, How Soon Is Now, and I mean, Anthony and I both applied for this essay contest with Bigelow around consciousness after death. And, I've been reading through the essays that won. Some of them were very interesting, but I'm particularly been fascinated by this philosopher, Bernardo Kastrup. I mean, when I wrote my book, 2012, Return of Quetzalcoatl, I ended up kind of arriving at this idea of monistic idealism, that actually the universe is actually consciousness, and consciousness constructs kind of like dissociated projections, like alters of itself that are experience separation and individuation. That's what we are, so that it can explore its creative capacities, discover its own evolutionary potential and so on. So, I think, and Kastrup has formalized this analytic idealism and presented very, very powerful logical arguments for why it basically should supersede materialism. And what's beautiful about idealism, as I'd already understood in the 2012 book, and his work, I think, just helps make even more explicit, is, from this idealist worldview, you have a much deeper openness to the different religions of the world as different ways of expressing the transcendent qualities of human experience. And so this could actually, whereas the secular scientific materialist worldview that's dominated over the last few hundred years has cut off, like, sort of the cutting edge of like science and engineers and bourgeois, kind of capitalists from, the human population as a whole. The idealist worldview, as it becomes, more commonly understood and held, it will reintegrate the world into one whole. We will be able to understand and accept, the value of different religions, Christian, Muslim, Taoist, and so on. We'll have more, indigenous, animism. We'll be able to have full respect. We'll be able to re-dignify and, understand that the necessity for all these different cultures as part of a unified planetary whole. And I think that is our necessary path back to living with peace and unity on the planet. Like, I think that is a possible outcome. It's just that understanding has to spread very rapidly, because we're going to hit these crux points. We're already hitting them in terms of crises and stuff like that.
Does remind me a lot of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's idea of the Omega point and the noosphere, and us kind of racing towards this unification. Mike asked a question. He said, I read your piece in the book DMT Entity Encounters. I was intrigued by your mention of Sergio Mangana's idea that we're going through a shift and how Trump exemplified this tricksterism. Where do you think this shift will lead us?
Yeah, well, I think I kind of just stated it, but I mean, what do I know? I mean, I think we're going to see, we're seeing, rapid evolutions in some areas, but we're all, more and more people turning on to certain, practices, consciousness, and, I'm very fascinated even by, certain parts of the developments that are happening in blockchain, like the DAOs, the distributed autonomous organizations, ways that people can collaborate on a global scale without hierarchical, centralized dominant structures. So, I think, we're in this rapid evolutionary stage. Probably some people are going to choose, the technological singularity and, have chips implanted in their brains and become kind of like cyborgs connected to this sort of Ahrimanic digital matrix. Other people are going to choose to, reconnect with nature and reharmonize and explore plant, medicines and create these sort of like, new harmonic communities of the future. Yeah, I mean, one of Mangana's ideas, which he explains is from his elders in the Toltec lineage, is that it's kind of like we're moving from the fifth sun to the sixth sun. We're now in the age of the sixth sun, and there's a polarity in these suns, which each last like 5,000, ish years, 6,000 years, between light and darkness. So the last 6,000 years, we've been under a sun of light, which from Mangana's perspective, it's not like light or darkness is like evil and good. the light is a time of like rationality, focus on quantifiable material, kind of like daylight, sort of left brain. And as we move into the set of darkness, it switches around, and then sort of the predominant focus for humanity goes more into the dream world, the psyche, the unconscious. And in a strange way, this rapid technological evolution is kind of in some ways leading us to a more dreamlike reality where, through biotechnology, we can transform nature, with artificial intelligence, our machines are becoming alive. I think that there's something very, very significant happening here. And I feel that was a useful articulation to think our way through it.
I think your point was very interesting about the idea that in some way that hallucinogenic substances and entheogens and everything else are going to become more commercialized, and also us developing a greater understanding of the unification of different spiritual groups. And I was immediately reminded there, of course, Aldous Huxley and his concept of the perennial philosophy, and the idea that there is a grain of something that's in every religion that is universal. And of course, then when you were mentioning it there, immediately I was thinking of his book, The Island, and the various other books that Huxley, and I know that both you and I are very interested in the writings of Huxley, and it shows in many ways that probably he was quite perceptive, I think, in terms of where he was going with this. Now, we're getting towards the end now, Daniel, in terms of our hour with you, and it's been intriguing and absolutely fascinating. Where is your work now going? What direction are you taking your work in the future? Because I know that you're reissuing, I think, am I right in reissuing 2012? Or you're rebranding it in some way. But where are you going with your work now? Where is Daniel Pinchbeck's interest for the future?
Well, I mean, with 2012, it's simply that we finally have an audiobook of it. For whatever reason, even though it was a very successful book back then, the publisher hasn't really done much for it. So I'm very excited. A good friend of mine read the audiobook. So that's available. I do a regular newsletter on Substack, which people can sign up for, and then we have information, but then also it's on the liminalinstitute.com is where I've been doing all these courses and so on. There's sort of the two things that are very compelling to me at the moment. And I'm a Gemini, so I shift around a lot or whatever, but I'd like to expand on the after death ideas that I developed for the Bigelow paper. And I also did a course on the Liminal Institute about looking at afterlife consciousness and so on. So that might take the form of a book. But then I'm also very, very interested in, I definitely feel that we're in a kind of emergency, like we're moving towards a catastrophic sequence of events. How humanity rebounds and deals with that, whether we actually just physically all go extinct, which I think is totally possible, or whether we are able to construct, kind of new structures, socioeconomic, cooperative structures. This is really, I think, a crux time for that. And so in that way, I'm very interested in some of the developments in blockchain and this idea of these distributed autonomous organizations as a way that you could have global networks of coordination. So that might be an area to explore, not just writing about it, but actually trying to create one or be involved with one of them. Just theory to practice. I tried that years ago. I had a company, a nonprofit called Evolver, where we had the Evolver network. We were kind of created a model for local groups. We had like 70 local groups. And I still think it was one of the best ideas that I've seen. I've also been interested in Transition Town, sort of doing a similar thing. Zeitgeist Social Movement was doing a similar thing. But for me, it's like, if we could properly integrate this sort of consciousness layer, this that we were just talking about with Sarah, with the tools for people to come together to actually engage in ecologically regenerative practices. We are hitting some very, very severe hard limits in our situation. Like, scientists say that the Amazon rainforest will collapse as a functional system, within 15 years, the way it's being deforested now. And that's the hydrological heart of planet Earth. So at that point, the world becomes much more difficult and turbulent and dusty. We already see things heading in that direction. So we somehow, and I mean, I've been writing about this stuff, now for over 20 years, but for whatever reason, we haven't yet been able to redirect our collective kind of social and imaginal forces, partially just because we're all so dependent on this fossil fuel infrastructure. I mean, very few of us are outside this system. So
I guess that a lot more people are going to start opting out of the system, though, especially with something like coronavirus. That's highlighted the fragility of the system and inspired a lot of people to not be part of urban centres, to move into the countryside. I think, a lot of the people that I'm friends with are talking about trying to set up communities in the countryside where they could grow their own food, because even now you're noticing increases in the cost of food and the quality of food, and those kind of networks have broken down at this very slight, really, in terms of what it is, a slight disruption has already caused chaos. So, I mean, we're lucky in the UK because we don't have terrifying weather systems, but for people that I know in areas of the US or elsewhere where they're experiencing firsthand like dramatic weather changes, you can see how everything can go tits up quite easily.
Yeah, I mean, and also England, I think, could be a fascinating place for kind of implementing kind of other models and other ideas that could have global significance. I mean, I feel in some ways like, China and India have, mimicked in a way, certain aspects of Western capitalism, consumerism. They wanted to bring also their populations from kind of neo-feudal conditions up to modern conditions. But if the modern West was to innovate again and say, okay, like actually we made mistakes, like this path we were on, not only is it ecologically destructive, it's not even very good for people. Like people are trapped in these hamster wheels of factory jobs. Now let's move towards a post-work degrowth society where we actually liberate people's time to share love with their family, to explore their creative pursuits, to explore consciousness. That to me is the next edge of where we need to go.
I think that is a wonderful final statement there, Daniel. I think we were getting into some very, very interesting areas, and I think we could really start discussing this in greater detail, but I think you're quite right. I think we are facing something that is going to be catastrophic, or it's going to be changing in a massive way, and it's how we react to this as to whether we survive as a species or not. And I think that we are both unfortunate or we are all fortunate and unfortunate to be part of this. I sometimes feel that we're actually existing in this dystopian end of the world movie. We're in it, we can't escape from it. But anyway, thank you very much for your time, Daniel. It's been I've really appreciated that. So just very quickly, if anybody wants to contact you again, I know you've mentioned your various locations, but if you can mention them again so that
absolutely. Pinchbeck.substack.com is the newsletter, and www.theliminal LIMINAL Institute .com is the web course platform. So those are the two mainstays. I'm on Instagram and Twitter and all that stuff, but those are my two main things right now.
Okay, guys, and do get in touch with Daniel because his work is crucially important, and he's very much a visionary in terms of these things, and somebody that really has thought long and hard about ecology, spirituality, and everything else as well. So, Daniel, thank you very much for spending an hour with us. I know that you're an extremely busy guy, and I'm just very, very grateful that you spent some time with us. It's been really, really good.
Thanks, Anthony.
Okay, well, everybody, thanks again for listening in. And as usual, Sarah, thank you very much for your hard work in the background. And we'll be back soon with another edition. So thank you very much and goodbye to all of you, and have the wonderful rest of your Sunday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.